Hello and welcome to the Wildcard Rewind podcast. The divisional round is nearly in the books. This week we are reviewing the top storylines of the team in each of the games that's happened so far. Let's get into it.
I just wanna rewind to when we were young and hard. Back to all those good times. Take me back to the start.
So, welcome in. We have nearly all of the divisional round behind us. Just a couple of games left, with obviously Bills Steelers being delayed until today, which is super exciting. I'm your host, Lewis. Just before we get started, I just want to have a little plug. I've started up my own new website with Dynasty analysis. It's called Dynasty Pancake. It's available at dynastypancake.co.uk. There's some really fun things on there, including a new series called Old and Stinky about all of the veteran players that you don't really know what to do with in Dynasty. But that's my plug out of the way. We have no Paul today. It's a lovelier guest, a lovelier co-host in Hannah. Hannah, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Lewis. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I've read all of your articles so far, and I think they've been awesome. So I would recommend for anybody to head across there. Definitely, I think so far you've done Cooper Cup and Austin Eckler, haven't you, in your Old and Stinky series? And they're definitely two players that I have been struggling to decide what I should be doing with them. So you've been helping me out greatly. I think we're going to be having a bit of a chat about one of those players a bit later on, but yeah, definitely head over there. I really enjoyed the weekend of games. I don't know what you thought, Lewis, but I know they weren't all of them that close, but there were certainly some shocks, and I just love kind of the unpredictability of the playoffs, and I just enjoyed them all. And now I'm a neutral, you see. I'm used to the Bengals being in the playoffs. They're not there this year. I feel way more relaxed than usual, so I'm quite enjoying it.
Well, I can join you being a neutral now. I don't know how much I can say I enjoyed the full round of games. And I think this morning, although I was very tired, I was slightly more able to kind of recognize the achievement of the Lions and reflect on, the games that we've had so far. And three of them, I would say, aside from Dolphins Chiefs, which to be fair was the only game that I didn't watch. You had two really close games, and then in Packers Cowboys, you had an unbelievable upset, which was incredibly exciting to watch. But I think we obviously are going to go matchup by matchup. And what I wanted to do is talk about the biggest narrative from each team looking into next season. So that includes the teams that are still in and the teams that have been knocked out. So we will save our thoughts on each game as we go through. But the big thing that I wanted to start off with today is head coaching vacancies. So we're in a really interesting stage. We have a bunch of head coaching vacancies available. The Patriots obviously has already been filled with Jared Mayo, which I think was really interesting. And I'm surprised that they managed to hide the succession plan. I found that very interesting, that there was clearly this kind of clause in the contract and everyone in the building knew what was coming. They'd had that in mind with Mayo to take over from Belichick whenever he left, but no one from the outside knew about it. In fact, I think we all thought it was a shoo-in that Vrabel was going to take over. But the other vacancies available are now the Commanders, the Chargers, the Panthers, Falcons, Raiders, Seahawks, and Titans. That is a huge amount of vacancies. That is just under a quarter of the league, which is pretty huge. We also could have a couple more about to join. I wouldn't even be surprised if we have another one join while we're recording, based off the back of last night's results. But the question I wanted to ask you, looking at the situations in all of these franchises, when it comes to who's on the roster already, the cap situation, where they're picking, which vacancy do you think is let's start with the most appealing of the jobs that are open currently?
So I'm going to be a bit naughty, Lewis, because again, we're probably going to be talking about this a little bit later. But, look, I think well, I don't know what you think, but I suspect you think like I do that there's going to be a new coaching vacancy coming out, and we're pretty sure it's going to be the Cowboys. So for me personally, I think if I had the option, I think that's a pretty desirable one, to take. Ultimately, you've got pretty much all the pieces there. You just got to get over the line, and I do think that a different kind of coaching strategy might just do that. So I think, I reckon I would be pretty pleased to go with that. But look, being serious, I think I'm probably mentioning the one that you think, Lewis, but I do think that the Commanders does look appealing. But I know that that's your one, so I'm going to leave you to chat about that one. I do think kind of my second option probably would be the Falcons. No, they haven't got a QB, but I do think they're going to have options this year, even though are they picking 10th or 8th?
I think it's slightly later. I think it's close to kind of 14 or 15.
Is it? So I think they may well not get a quarterback, one of those top elite ones, but I do think there's quite a few interesting options potentially on the trade or free agency market. Look, I think Justin Fields might go quite nicely in there. You could try and lure a Kirk Cousins or someone like that. They are 8th. So, I mean, they're reasonably high. They could maybe get one of those kind of second tier down quarterbacks. But I think if I was them, I'd probably be looking to try and get like a Fields, to be honest. And I think, there's pieces there. I do think the defense is stepping up and getting better. So I think for me, that would be the second kind of option. But I think I could probably convince myself that the Commanders is the most appealing, along with you, Lewis.
That's what I went for, and this is a really interesting one because you're kind of, when you're trying to look about what's a more appealing job, you're looking at lots of different things in terms of, is it about the pieces which are already in place, or is it about what you can do with the roster going forwards? And I think for a lot of head coaches, you look and you want to be able to shape a team in your own image. So obviously, it kind of goes without saying that the best quarterbacks team on this list is the Los Angeles Chargers. So that's a really tempting one about, do you just go and work with Justin Herbert? That's an incredibly exciting opportunity. The problem is the Chargers currently, of the current 7 vacancies, they have the least cap space, with they're currently projected to be 35 million over the cap next year. They have, an aging roster. They're lacking on picks because of some of the trades they've made for people like Khalil Mack. And aside from Justin Herbert, and obviously I suppose someone like Derwin James, but who do you have on that roster to build around? Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are great, but they're 32 and 30. Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa are great. Khalil Mack's 34. Joey Bosa's not getting any younger either. And you have no cap flexibility. You've got the number 5 overall pick, but you've got no cap flexibility to make changes with that roster. So the reason why I ended up going for the Commanders, and I think this is a slightly strange one, you have a new owner, so you have someone that wants to invest in a team and wants to go out and make big splashes. You have a franchise that hasn't won. I mean, hasn't won is the answer, but hasn't been good in a very long time. So you'll have, and they've been through it a lot recently. With Dan Schneider and everything that's come along with him, but also with all the controversy around the name change and playing as the football team for a year. I think it's been quite difficult for them, and having to see their division rivals do quite well. They have the most cap space of not just of any team with a head coaching vacancy, but of any team. So they have 78.1 million projected for next year. They have the 2nd overall pick, so you are guaranteed, let's say, one of Caleb Williams and Drake May. We presume it's going to be Drake May. but you're guaranteed one of the rookie quarterbacks who are both incredibly exciting. They have more draft capital as well because they've got 2 seconds and 2/3 from the trades of Chase Young and Montez Sweat. So yeah, the defense is missing a lot of pieces, but then on the offense, you've got 2. I'm going to say young. Terry McLaurin actually is sneaky old, but Jahan Dotson's young. You've got 2 quite exciting wide receivers. Logan Thomas isn't bad. Brian Robinson's a decent running back, but you've got a roster that like you can really shape in your own image, as well as the second overall pick. So I think the Commanders for me and I didn't think this would be the case until I looked into it. I think the Commanders is the most exciting one. And I think we've gone for the same in terms of the least appealing. Who do you have? What vacancies do you think is potentially the worst to take over?
To me, I personally think this is obvious, Lewis. Like, it has to be the Panthers, right? I mean, it's the owner. It's David Tepper, isn't it? It sounds to me like he just wants control of everything. He's not giving anyone a chance to actually do their jobs. He's giving nobody time to do anything either. So I think ultimately he's going to be an absolute nightmare. And as I say, it's not necessarily about the roster because you've got last year's number 1 overall pick. Yes, he didn't show a lot this season, but there wasn't a lot to work with either. His wide receiver core was nothing. He didn't really have very good running backs to help him out. So, I don't necessarily think that he's a total write-off, but, I think there's pieces there you could work with. I just think Tepper is just going to be too much of a nightmare, if I'm honest. And I just think any coaches that have options will not choose to go there. And I think they'll go elsewhere, which ultimately I think it doesn't mean that these coaches aren't going to be good, but I think ultimately it's going to mean that a coach who didn't have another option is going to end up going there and potentially having a hard time. And I think my concern for Bryce Young is that his confidence has been knocked. And my question is, will he ever gain that back? And I think they may have damaged him potentially beyond repair. That's what worries me about Bryce Young. And I think ultimately, this new coaching staff will probably sync with him as well. So I don't think they're going to be here very long because I think anybody with options is not going to go there.
So I completely agree that I think the Panthers is the least appealing vacancy. Part of it as well is obviously not having, you've traded away your first round pick for this year to go and get a quarterback who last year, yes, was kind of seen as the consensus QB1 in the class, even though that doesn't look the case right now. There's an argument that he's QB4. I mean, I think you could even argue that Aiden O'Connell played better than him at sometimes last year, but I don't want to get into that hot of a take. I think the problem is Bryce Young so far has shown himself to be kind of a very specific style of quarterback, and he's kind of a bit marmitey in terms of him as a prospect being shorter. That I think it's not just that you don't have flexibility in terms of you're going to have to go in and try and make Bryce Young work. But you might find that there's lots of people that go, actually, well, I was the offensive coordinator on this team. Say Bobby Slowick. I was the offensive coordinator on the Texans last year when we were doing our pre-draft evaluations, and I was trying to talk the building away from Bryce Young because I didn't really want to work with him. Then it also, like you say, comes down to the fact that I think they're going to get the last candidate. I think it could be quite similar to the Texans a couple of years ago where they ended up with David Culley, and you have a candidate out of nowhere that no one thinks about. And I think it's just a really kind of unappealing spot. They have, of the teams with vacancies, they have the 4th most cap space, so right in the middle, 407 with 34.3 million. They're also hiring a new GM, but they have an owner that seems like they're gonna kind of step into everything, which isn't particularly encouraging. So I think the Panthers, to me, definitely feels like the worst spot. And I think it's interesting to see what happens to them going into next season. But let's get into the Super Wildcard weekend and all of the games that took place. So I want to talk through kind of our thoughts on each game, but then go through team by team. And we've got a couple of questions that we want to think about in terms of the biggest narratives for these teams going into next year. We'll obviously start off with the first game of the weekend, which was Texans-Browns. And obviously we've just touched on the Texans in terms of ending up with CJ Stroud, which felt like a consolation prize, and now he's been absolutely unbelievable. So this was a really close game until it then wasn't. It was 45-14 to the Texans over the Browns. It genuinely, going back and forth in the first the first quarter, the first few drives, you thought, wow, this is going to be a game for the ages. And then Flacco just started throwing interceptions. 2 of them returned for touchdowns. CJ Stroud had a hell of a day, 274 yards and 3 passing touchdowns. Devin Singletary played really well, 66 yards and a touchdown. Nico Collins, 96 yards and a touchdown. Basically, all of the young Texans, or all of their slightly under the radar weapons, showed out. What did you think about the game itself? Did you enjoy watching kind of the Joe Flacco story?
So I very much enjoyed it because obviously as a Bengals fan, I did not want the Browns to win. So I enjoyed the meltdown, to be honest. I personally think that I actually think that the Texans had command of the game pretty much. From the start, you could tell they were going out aggressive. I think CJ Stroud played fantastic. And, as soon as that first interception happened, I kind of thought this is the death toll for the Browns. They did try, and Njoku got quite a few receptions. I mean, Amari Cooper was very quiet. Elijah Moore did absolutely nothing. They tried. Obviously, Kareem Hunt, had a reasonable day.
DFS
but on the whole,
Kareem Hunt.
I know, gutted because I was like, oh, Jerome Ford. But anyway, it is what it is. I don't know. I just kind of felt like as soon as the Texans had that first interception, they had confidence, and that was it. They were in control. The Browns defense wasn't the Browns defense we were expecting. Myles Garrett didn't get enough, involvement. Obviously, they game planned well enough to keep him kind of out of the game, and they were injured on the back end, which I think didn't help. But ultimately, I just loved. This is like the Lions from. I know the Lions didn't get in last year, but that like feel good team, like they've gone from nothing to. I just think I love the narrative. I think CJ Stroud is fantastic, and everyone was like, "Oh, CJ Stroud, his whatever test it was, I forget what they call it."
The Wonderlic.
That was it. He obviously doesn't know anything, blah blah blah, and he just comes in absolutely balling. And I just think, I just love D'Amico Ryans as well, and I think he's turned this whole Texans team around. The Texans were a laughingstock for 3 years, weren't they? Going from head coach to head coach, the Deshaun Watson palaver, everything was just a disaster. Everyone thought the Texans were just terrible. He comes in, he changes the culture, and look where they are now. I think they, hitting on those 2 picks, CJ Stroud and Will Anderson, has changed everything.
The thing which I don't think we talk about enough in terms of narrative is that the Texans were the team that Deshaun Watson was on. And I know he wasn't in this game, but like the Texans versus the Browns, that was the narrative, that this was supposed to be Deshaun Watson's team. And he's been absolutely dreadful. But it also means that when they traded up for Will Anderson, they traded up using an additional first. They sent away the Browns first instead of their own. And people looked at that and went, right, so you're giving up another top 5 pick for 2024, and by beating the Browns, they've made that the right decision. They backed themselves and it came off. So I want to start off by talking about the Texans and the narratives for them going into next season. And obviously, CJ Stroud is the biggest one. So CJ Stroud was the QB 11 on the season in terms of points per game. He finished as the QB 10, although that does include quarterbacks with limited sample sizes like Joe Flacco and Kirk Cousins. So you can call it QB8 for people who started more than 12 games. He's going to win Rookie of the Year. My own feelings on that aside, and is a very deserving winner. A rookie season, over 4,000 yards, over 20 passing touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. He's thrown maybe the least interceptions of a quarterback who started over 12 games, which is genuinely insane for a rookie. That's genuinely mad. That's nearly as many as Dak Prescott threw last night alone. For next season, it's partly looking at Dynasty as well for this off season. Personally, I actually was trying to sell CJ Stroud today because I think maybe the hype's gone a little bit out of control. Do you think we should be looking at CJ Stroud in terms of that upper echelon of quarterbacks going into 2024? You're looking at kind of, you'll start off drafts with Allen, Hurts, Lamar, Mahomes, probably Burrow as well. Do you think Stroud should be going around that range, or do you think he should be a little bit further down next year?
I wouldn't be upset to take him at the bottom end of that range, personally, at all. I do genuinely think that he is an extremely talented quarterback, and I think around the Herbert range, I would happily do. I wouldn't be worried about doing that at all. Like, I think this guy's talented. He's going to be a great quarterback in the NFL. We've got to remember what he's done over the second half of the season. Obviously, he was injured for 2 games, so his overall end of season numbers are going to be lower because he didn't play for 2 games. And also, he's been playing without, pretty much nearly the whole season, he was playing without one of Nico Collins or Tank Dell. I think there were a couple of games where they were both together. But in this playoff run, he's basically had Nico Collins and no one else. Noah Brown's not doing anything because he's injured. He is elevating everyone on this team, and I think that is an elite quarterback. Yes, he's not a running QB like Allen, Hurts, so you're not going to have him in that top 3. Mahomes is always going to be in there, even though he's had a terrible season for fantasy. He's still going to hang in that top 3. But how is Stroud any different to Burrow would be my question. All Herbert, he scrambles when he has to, but he doesn't run like the Lamars of the world. So again, I would probably have Allen, Hurts, Mahomes, Lamar in that kind of tier. Lamar probably at the bottom because obviously he played fantastic, but his fantasy numbers weren't great this year. Then in that next tier, I personally would probably have Burrow, Herbert, Stroud, I think. And then you're looking at, your how confident are you with your Colts quarterback, or I can't think of his name.
Anthony Richardson.
That's it. How confident with the Anthony Richardson? Because for me, he's the wild card.
Yeah.
Because he was injured. How good is he going to be coming back? He's a Fields-esque type. He can be a QB1. And I think he does have a flaw, but where's his flaw? And I think I would personally go Stroud over, him, even though I think potentially his ceiling might be higher.
Yeah. I think the next tier is then looking, so I think you've got 3 quite similar quarterbacks in Richardson, Kyler, and Fields, depending on where Fields is. I suppose Dak as well needs to be considered in that conversation, but I think the hype on CJ Stroud can be both justified and also slightly over the top. He exploded towards the back half of the season. He finishes the QB1 against Tampa, the QB4 at a stretch where he finished in the top 10 4 games in a row. But I think he's one of those in the same range as Burrow that I'm like, yes, you have the ability to finish as the QB1 any week, but you're more likely to finish consistently as the QB7 because there's just less rushing baseline. So kind of you have to explode for a lot of passing touchdowns. It's why in Dynasty I'm potentially looking to sell him, because if I can tear off him to Justin Herbert and a late first, I think that's worth it. If I can do CJ Stroud straight up for Lamar Jackson, I'll take Lamar Jackson over him. But I think it's interesting. I think that the argument around CJ Stroud, I think he's going to be a really heavily betted MVP candidate for next year. People love second-year quarterbacks for MVP, and I wouldn't be surprised. He won't be the favorite going into it because Patrick Mahomes should be the favorite every year he's in the league. But I think CJ Stroud is going to be someone that people put a lot of money on winning MVP next year.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Look, if I can get Herbert or Burrow plus something for Stroud, then I would do that because I think they're in the same tier. Agreed.
Yeah.
Also, if I could do, straight up for Lamar, I would do that. But ultimately, I think your Kyler, kind of tier. Ultimately, we know that Kyler the Fields, etc. They probably have the higher ceiling. But there's question marks around them. I personally think, like, maybe if Kyler has a better offense, he will jump higher than Stroud because he's got that rushing floor. But ultimately, Fields, I suspect, is going to be in a different offense next year. What is he or isn't he going to do? Obviously, injuries, etc. So, yeah, I agree, but I still think he's certainly in that, quarterback one, like mid quarterback one tier. I think. Agreed,
Yeah.
he's not going to be the quarterback one every week, but I do think that I would be very happy to have him on my team versus some of the others.
Yeah, no, for sure. What's your big narrative for the Texans for next year?
So the thing that I would like to ask you, Lewis, which I think is going to be a really interesting conversation over the whole of the offseason. I think there's going to be lots of different opinions. My question is, where will you be drafting Nico Collins and Tank Dell in 2024 drafts? My first question is, who are you going to be drafting higher? And my second question is, where, do you think, I suppose let's just look in the wide receiver landscape. Where would you value them in terms of ranking them for next season?
So I ran a poll on Twitter the other day asking, who do you think is the Texans wide receiver one? And the answer was Nico Collins quite overwhelmingly. It was like 75% towards Nico Collins. I'm very in on Tank Dell. I have them back to back in my dynasty rankings, so I think it's wide receiver 8 and 9, or it might be 9 and 10. They're both very high. But I have Tank Dell just a tick above, just because when they played together, Tank Dell was outperforming Nico Collins, not by a huge amount, but he was outperforming him. It's also Tank Dell's first year in the league, so to be performing that way as a rookie, I'm super in on. I'm also a sucker for kind of the smaller, shifty wide receiver. Tutu Atwell can still happen. But to me, I think, to slightly answer the question in a slightly different question, the one I'll end up drafting is going to be the one that goes later. So if I can I think Nico Collins will go first. So if I can take Tank Dell a round afterwards, if that's the way that ADP shakes out, or like half a round later, then I'll do that. I think the answer is probably going to be around kind of the mid third round. I think if they start getting up, in the way that Calvin Ridley rose to like the back end of the second, mid second, I don't know how I'd feel about taking them then, because I just think there's going to be a decent wide receiver landscape that you can look at other players around there, and I don't know whether I want to be taking them as like an elite wide receiver one just yet. But if I can get them towards the start of the third round, if I can go, say I'm picking at the 101 and I could start off with CMC, and then on the way back, I could get like a Travis Etienne and Nico Collins, or a Devontae Adams and Tank Dell. I think I'd be quite happy taking them around that sort of range. I would like to do it later, but isn't it always the case that we'd like to do it later? I'd love to pick Justin Jefferson in the 9th round, but I'm not going to be able to.
I just wonder, Lewis, when they were both on the field, sometimes we would have this kind of, one of them would have a great day, one of them would be a bit quiet. And I do just wonder, like in redraft, if they end up being a little bit of a headache next season, in that, 1 week the game plan will mean that one of them will feast, the next week the other one will. And I think in some ways they will kind of eat into each other, in the fact that your confidence in them on a week-to-week basis, I think, is going to be a bit up and down. And I'm not sure we're going to know who is going to be the guy. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be useful on your team, but I think they're going to be a little bit up and down. And I do think these two, I want them on my redraft teams, but I do think I'll feel less of a headache if they're on my best ball teams than if they're on my redraft teams. Because although I think they will put up points, even if they're like the wide receiver 2 for that week, I could see a kind of situation where one of them totally, goes off and the other one's a little bit quieter, and vice versa as we go along in the season.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting narrative. Another one which I think is interesting, and I'm going to ask the question for fantasy. So this is now looking at the Browns side. Is we got to talk about Deshaun Watson, and I don't want to. Deshaun Watson had a pretty dreadful season, injured for the majority of it, bad when he was playing. Not just kind of, an injured season, but even when he was playing, he didn't look the same quarterback. But he's not played football in kind of 2 years. Giving him that fully guaranteed deal looks genuinely insane. His cap hit for the next 3 seasons is 63.9 million. So it's about a quarter of your cap on a quarterback that you're not sure if you would really want to play. I was just looking into, because I was trying to figure out, and it's something I might look out into the ether to talk about going forwards. If they were if they wanted to trade him away with that contract, because that's the only way they can really get out of it is if they trade him, how much would you have to add on top to get away from the Deshaun Watson contract? But the other thing I was looking into, so the biggest dead cap hit of all time is the Matt Ryan, when they cut Matt Ryan. Or did they? No, they traded him to the Colts, didn't they? Which was a cap hit of 40 million. If the Texans cut Deshaun Watson right now, their dead money hit, the amount of dead money they'd have from it, would be $200 million, which is just insane. What do you think about Deshaun Watson kind of for next season? Is he someone that you think could end up being a bit of a value? Do you see any life in him going forwards, or is he, do you think he's kind of dead in the water?
I personally think he's cooked. He was pretty terrible this season. You can say, oh, that last game he played, he was looking much better, but then he got injured, and then he's been missing for the whole rest of this season. So I mean, he's barely played at all, since he basically refused to play for the Texans. What was that now? 3 years ago?
Yeah.
And I just think we're never going to see. People, I think, are still holding on to the Deshaun Watson that they saw at the Texans, and they think at some point he's going to appear and actually start to do something. And I just don't think that's the case. I personally am avoiding him at all costs. I think the challenge in Dynasty is that if you've got him on your team, nobody wants him.
Nope.
So you're stuck with him on your Dynasty teams. I'm out at all costs in redraft, even if he falls, lower than low. I just don't think I'm going to be able to push the button.
I genuinely think I'd rather take kind of, I mean, and I'm a Stafford believer anyway because I'm a massive homer, but I'd rather take Stafford over him. I'd probably take Derek Carr over him for next season. Trevor Lawrence, 100%. Whoever's starting for the Seahawks, but a bunch of the rookies, wherever Kirk Cousins is. I think Deshaun Watson is then going to end up falling as my QB 25. Which is crazy, but I just can't draft him anywhere. But I think that's going to be what everyone's going to do. I think there's a world in which Deshaun Watson goes towards the back end of drafts in terms of when you're taking your second quarterback as a potential upside pick. Someone who is definitely an upside pick for next year is the Browns narrative that you want to put to me.
Yeah, so my question for you, Lewis, is do you value David Njoku as a tight end 1 in 2024? So is he in that kind of second tier of tight ends? I personally don't think he's in that kind of top elite echelon, but is he in kind of tier 2, and this is kind of a bit of a side question, to be honest, and it's a little bit off topic, but who are you going to have in your elite tight end rankings next season? Is this now the time that Travis Kelce finally falls out, or do you still have some hope? I think we were kind of talking about this next, so maybe we can save it. But who are your elites? Let's not typically discuss totally Travis Kelce, we can talk about that in a minute, but who will you have in the elites?
I think elites is going to be quite tough next year because I think Kelsey will probably still be my tight end one for next season, and then I think it's really tough when you've got your big names who have been around for a while: Mark Andrews, TJ Hawkinson, depending on the quarterback situation, George Kittle. I'll actually be quite high on George Kittle for next season, I think. And then the real two young upstarts in Trey McBride and Sam Laporta. I think that to me is the elite group, and they're the ones that I am quite happy drafting relatively early. David Njoku is quite a difficult one for me. So if you look at his fantasy finishes with Deshaun Watson, a quarterback, because he exploded. He was a real league winner, that kind of 4-game run at the end of the season, tight end 2, tight end 2, tight end 4, tight end 3. But that was with Joe Flacco. With Deshaun Watson, so to start the season, tight end 28, 28, 23, tight end 12. Then coming out of the bye, played without Deshaun Watson, tight end 20. Then, Deshaun Watson's final 2 games, week 9 and week 10, tight end 13, tight end 7. So that's kind of one game that you're happy with under Deshaun Watson this year. So to me, I really like David Njoku. He won me a couple of titles, which is great. But I don't know that I'll be super in on him next year because, not to say we haven't seen him do it with Deshaun Watson, we've seen him not do it with Deshaun Watson. We've seen it not work with Deshaun. So to me, I think he potentially could be someone to avoid going into drafts next year.
Yeah, I think the issue that we're going to have is that people are going to look at the end of this season and be like, oh, look, he broke out at the end of this season. I do think he is really talented. But like you say, with Deshaun Watson, the connection just wasn't there. And he didn't do anything. But I think people are not going to kind of think of that. They're just going to see, oh, look at his finishes at the back half of the season. Look what he did in, that one playoff game or whatever. And they're going to put him in that kind of, I suspect he's going to be in that, like McBride, like second bit down, like McBride type area. And I just think that's going to be too expensive. Yeah. So that's why I'm going to avoid him. Like if he ended up being a late round tight end, I would probably give it a go because, we know he's talented. Maybe Watson might do something, although I don't think so. Then maybe I'd take a punt on him, but I think he's going to be too expensive and not give you enough value. I would rather take a punt on, someone else later on. I think the tight end landscape is really interesting to discuss for next season. And maybe when we talk about the next question, we can dig into it a little bit more. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Njoku. I'm probably going to be out. So I think he's going to be expensive.
I'm cautious that we're 38 minutes in and we've gone through one game. So we'll move on. The next game was the Chiefs taking down the Miami Dolphins. I found this very funny. The Dolphins have been a flat track bully all season. They absolutely stomp over bad teams. They lose to good ones. We weren't even sure if the Chiefs were a good team. Obviously, they beat them in Germany a few weeks ago, but the Dolphins could do nothing. The Chiefs shut down the running game, and then aside from Tyreek Hill, nothing happened through the air. Tua threw quite a bad interception. Mahomes had a decent fantasy day, a decent day all round. But in the freezing cold, and Andy Reid's moustache was the big talking point of this game, alongside Rashee Rice's 8 receptions for 130 yards and a touchdown. I actually was a Devon Achan touchdown away from about 200 quid. As I placed it, I was like, that should have been Tyreek Hill. I got everything else spot on. I think it was, I think I had a Pacheco touchdown. Took the over on Rashee Rice, took the under on Raheem Mostert. But anyway, oh no, it wasn't. No, I had a big touchdown. Acheron from the first 2 games. I had Kareem Hunt, Dalton Schultz, Achan, and Pacheco, and only missed on Achan. But that's not what the show's about. I want to skip to the Dolphins to start with. I know we'll come back to the tight end conversation, but Tua Tagovailoa is really interesting to me this offseason. He is the only one of that draft class. That fantastic 2020 draft with, now looking unbelievable with Jordan Love breaking out as well, but Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts, Jordan Love, and Tua. The others have all been paid, and 3 of them have been paid gigantic contracts. Tua hasn't. He is playing on his 5th-year option next season. The Dolphins, I don't know what they do with him, because to me, I don't know that he's good. I think he's fine. I think he's a relatively average quarterback who is surrounded by incredible weapons and maybe the best play caller in the NFL, or one of the best play callers in the NFL. Certainly the most exciting young head coach, because Sean McVay isn't exciting anymore because we're used to him. I don't know that Tua on his own is a fantastic quarterback, and I think they could achieve the same thing as they would get from a $45 million extension for him by going out and getting Russell Wilson or Kirk Cousins. I think they could do the same thing for significantly cheaper. What are your thoughts on what happens with Tua this offseason?
I personally think they're going to do one of 2 things. So one is that they extend him to some sort of contract. I don't think they're going to do that, the Burrow, Herbert type thing. I think they'll try and, do that a bit lower, but obviously who knows what he's going to be wanting. Or actually next season he can play on his 5th-year option. So one option they could do is they just play it out. They say, I'm not going to extend you this season. You can play your 5th-year contract out, and then we'll decide in one season what we're going to do. I suspect that they're going to be the one of the 2 things that they're going to do. I agree that I don't think he has played extremely well within this system. I think that Mike McDaniels has been very good in putting playmakers around him, but you can tell that he can't lift the offense. The offense has to lift him, if you know what I mean. It has to be perfect for him to kind of succeed, and everything dropped off. There are injuries, blah, blah, blah. They don't do well in cold weather. That's where it all dropped off. But I do think that they're probably thinking better the devil, ultimately.
Yeah.
Are you going to find anyone better? Well, in the draft, no. In free agency, maybe the same. But would you say remarkably better? Probably not. And I understand he's cheaper, but is it worth taking that risk and getting rid of him to put in someone like Kirk Cousins, who probably will do very well, but you don't know how he's going to settle into that type of offense?
Yeah.
You know that when things are going well, Tua works. So why would you change it? I know that he's not going to get them over the hill, but
it all depends on what he asks for. If he comes in this offseason saying, I want the Burrow contract, I'm deserving of the Burrow contract, play out your 5th-year option, maybe tag you for a year, let you walk, and go and find something else. If he's happy with a Daniel Jones type deal, that $40 million per year, maybe I can consider doing it. But I think Tua is the most interesting extension story of this offseason, and there's a few coming up. The other question that you've got is on one of the weapons. So I'll let you take the reins.
Yeah, well, my question is obviously Jalen Waddle. He was being drafted in the 2nd round of fantasy drafts this season. I don't think he performed what we expected from that. Tyreek Hill was really kind of the main centerpiece of that offense. They use the running game a lot more. So most of the time, Waddle was kind of out on the sidelines. I think he gave us a couple of okay games, but really not what we expected for a 2nd-round pick. So what are your thoughts on him this season? Are you comfortable in drafting him? I know he was injured quite a bit this season, which probably had some sort of an effect. And if you're happy with drafting him, where do you feel comfortable to take him in drafts this season?
I'd be fine with Jalen Waddle around the sort of 4th to 5th round, which I think is probably around where he'll end up going. He was very disappointing this season. So he finished as the wide receiver 31. He didn't actually break 1,000 yards, which is obviously all right. He's just never going to be the alpha in the offense because they have maybe the best wide receiver in football, and with the rushing game as well, there's just not room for him to perform. So I think maybe around the 4th or 5th round, he's in that group of Devonta Smith, T. Higgins. I mean, maybe even Cup for next season. Maybe whichever Dell and Nico you think is the two of like wide receiver twos who would be great wide receiver ones elsewhere, but because of where they are, you just can't draft them as a wide receiver one. So Jalen Waddle just kind of worries me. I'm going to move us on to the Chiefs side because I'm cautious of time. So the big one for me, I'm going to combine the narratives for us. And in this game and across the course of this season, you've seen Rashee Rice ascend and you've seen Travis Kelce descend. What are your thoughts on Travis Kelce going into next season? Do you think he's washed? Do you think it's kind of the decline from here? And then Rashee Rice in particular, he's the wide receiver one on the team. He's what we've wanted out of him, and is really ascending up the ranks. Where do you think you'll draft him in 2024? Do you think you'd be comfortable with him as your wide receiver one on a fantasy team?
Kelce, I think that his time as like the tight end one, with which I would be comfortable to draft him as my first kind of skill player, so wide receiver or tight end, I think those days are gone, personally. Yeah. Like, he's getting older. He got injured this season, and I think that has been a lot of the reasons that he's been struggling. But he's only going to get older. He's only going to get more not injury prone, but he's been playing a long time. He's been banged up a lot. I do think injuries are going to start to pile up a little bit more. I think ultimately this is the slide. That doesn't mean that I don't think he's going to be a tight end one and that I wouldn't draft him along with the elites. But for me personally, I think the elites should not be going in round 1 or 2 this season. I really just don't think that anymore. And so I suspect someone's going to pick Travis Kelce before I'm comfortable in taking him in drafts, because they're going to think that he was injured and, it's Travis Kelce. I'm not comfortable doing that anymore. See, Rashee Rice is the wide receiver one, but I can't help thinking that they're going to want to add someone in there, next season.
Yeah.
I think people are going to draft Rashee Rice in like rounds 3 or 4 kind of thing. I
think you're right.
Around Nico Collins, Tank Dell area. I think that they're going to be very disappointed, because I don't think he's going to perform like that. I think they're going to add someone else. I think they like spreading the ball out. I don't think Rashee Rice is going to be the wide receiver. He's not going to be the Tyreek Hill on this offense.
Yeah, he's not going to be a complete, an absolute target hog in future.
Yeah, and he's just not a complete wide receiver, is he? He's great at what he can do, and obviously they're making sure he's getting in the positions and doing what he's best at. But he can't be the only bit of the offense. They're going to have to add someone else in. And I just think ultimately we're going to expect him to be the wide receiver one, and I just think we're going to be disappointed. And he might be on the team, but I just don't think that he's going to perform as highly as I think he'll get drafted.
Yeah, I think I agree on that front. Let's go on to the next game. This was very funny, and it ended up much closer than it actually was. So the Packers took down the Cowboys, finished 48-32, but obviously the Cowboys put together some late success in garbage time. It's what made it a decent day for Dak Prescott, even though it absolutely wasn't. We had 2 pick sixes for the Packers. It was really entertaining. The Cowboys, as far as I haven't actually checked Twitter while we've been recording, so it doesn't seem like Mike McCarthy's been sacked yet, but I am going to check and see whether or not he has been.
No, he hasn't.
No, hasn't been announced yet, and actually some players are announcing their support for him. But that's the big narrative for the Cowboys. Should they continue with him for next season? For me, no, absolutely not. I wouldn't go and get Bill Belichick. I don't think that's the answer. I think you need to go a young offensive mind, and start to kind of really change the offense for next season. I'd keep Dan Quinn, even though the defense underperformed. But Mike McCarthy is not the answer. He was never the answer, and I think he has to go. Do you think they should keep him, or do you think they should let him walk?
No, I think it's time, isn't it? You know, their expectations are higher than this, and they've never met them. You know, they had some good games this season, but they've had some also absolute clangers. And this game was a massive clanger, and they got embarrassed on national TV. So I'm confident that Jerry Jones is going to get rid of him. I think Jerry Jones is going to want Bill Belichick,
I agree.
which probably is going to be a mistake. But I'm kind of excited to see it because I think this defense is going to be lots of fun under Bill Belichick.
It's exactly the sort of thing that he would go and do. Jerry wants stars, and that includes in the head coach room, not just on the field. Let's move on to the Packers. And thinking of stars, I mean, Jordan Love, what an incredible day. I'm absolutely furious with the Packers that we all joked about, Jordan Love's going to be a Hall of Famer because it went Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers, Jordan Love. Jesus Christ, he might be. He actually might be in the end. So Jordan Love next year is going to be really interesting, but the Packers receiver core to me is really interesting. Initially, Christian Watson was the piece that people liked. Jaden Reed, we all kind of fell in love with. Jaden Reed then did nothing yesterday. It was all Romeo Dobbs. He had an absolute explosion for over 100 yards and a touchdown. Dontavian Wicks caught a touchdown. If you had to put your stamp on a Packers receiver right now for next season, who would you go for?
Do you know what? The thing that I find difficult is that we're desperate for there to be a wide receiver one, and for that wide receiver to be like the guy that dominates all the targets and therefore the guy that we want for fantasy. I think this is going to be a Chiefs type offense where there isn't a wide receiver one. One week it's going to be Christian Watson, one week it's going to be Jaden Reed, one week it's going to be Romeo Dobbs, one week it's going to be Devontae Wicks or whatever his name is. I personally don't think there's going to be a wide receiver one. I think potentially the most consistent guy next season probably going to be Jaden Reed, but I don't think that means that he's the guy that you should be drafting like 3 rounds before everyone else. I think ultimately these guys should be all drafted in a very similar place. Again, I think these are perfect guys for best ball, but I think these are going to be really difficult in redraft because I think 1 week you're going to have a great week and 1 week they're going to give you nothing.
Yeah, and Jaden Reed had the best fantasy season. He was the wide receiver 18 on the year. Next up was Dubs at wide receiver 39. The really interesting thing to me is Dubs was the only wide receiver not coming off the field last night, and that's the case when you look at snap count for the year. So he was on the field for, on average, 25% more snaps than any other wide receiver. So I think if I'm having to take a discount on one, because I think Reed will go ahead, I think Dubs could be of interest, but that feels a bit reactive off of last night. I want to make sure that I have time for a rant. So I'm going to move us on to the last game, knowing that we only have a few minutes left. So Rams Lions. It wasn't what I wanted it to be. It finished 24-23 to the Lions. Matt Stafford played an incredible game. He was absolutely fantastic. On the first few drives, Jared Goff looked like a Hall of Fame quarterback. He was unbelievable, just absolutely picking the Rams apart. I think it was 10 passes until we saw an incompletion from him, and the running game looked fantastic as well with Jahmyr Gibbs. The story of the night was Puka Nacua, 9 receptions for 181 yards and a touchdown, and he absolutely dominated. He was incredible. He also was held, and it was a pass interference on a missed goal from him. I was really disappointed with the refs last night. I don't like ranting about the refs after a game, but there were a couple of calls, including Matt Stafford getting hit in the head and stamped on, that wasn't flagged. To me, that was what kind of swung the game. But with a small amount of rest off the back of it, I can say that I'm happy for the Lions seeing them win their first playoff game in 60 years. The thing for me, I think, that I wrote about Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua in an article on the website, and looking at their their 17-game pace were from the games where they played together, so from weeks 5 to 17, and it was all Puka really. The 17-game pace would have seen Puka finish as the wide receiver 10 and Cooper Kupp as the wide receiver 16. So not hugely different, but it was quite clear that that Puka was way ahead of him, over 300 yards more averaging for the season. For next season, do you see any life in Cup? Or do you think Puka is really the player that you're going to target? I think there's a world in which Puka goes towards the back of round 1, by the way. Do you see any life in Cooper Kupp for next season?
I think there is. I just think that we can't expect Cooper Kupp to be the Cooper Kupp of old. Ultimately, he was basically the whole of that offense for 1.5 years because Robert Woods wasn't really the player we wanted him to be. Then he got injured, and then obviously they didn't really have anyone because the Robinson trade just all went wrong, free agency or whatever they did. I think now he's just going to be in more of a committee, and I just think he will still have some value, but we have to be realistic about what that is. He's not a round 1 wide receiver anymore. Really, he's a mid-round wide receiver who is going to be an injury risk. He has had some severe injuries. They can certainly, flare up again. Hopefully a full off season will that he's healthy next season and he'll do a lot more. I mean, he barely did anything last night. But, Puka, I personally think is going to be more of the Cooper Kupp role in terms of dominating more of the targets, but I still think Kupp is going to be involved.
Yeah, I actually bought a Puka Nacua jersey this morning. I'm ready. I'm all in. I think Kupp has some value. I think he's a dynasty buy right now because I think you can get him for a second. If you want to find out more, head to dynastypancake.co.uk and have a read about why I think Cooper Kupp could be of interest. Let's close out with the Lions. Jared Goff was really good in the first half and then started doing Jared Goff things later on. I think they were quite lucky to win in the end because there was a fumble, there was a really odd throw under pressure. He started doing some quite strange things. Do you think Jared Goff is the future in Detroit?
In the short term, yes, because I think they have no other option, personally. This is the Tua conversation all over again, isn't it? Who are you going to get? And I think ultimately they've done a great job in building around Jared Goff in that they can hide him for a lot of the time. Jared Goff, he does make some great plays and he is a very good player, but like you say, he does do silly things from time to time. And I think he can be very up and down. Some games he's great, some games he's not great. I think they're lucky that they're at home next week. I think that's really going to help them. But ultimately, yes, in the short term, I think he is because I don't think they've got any other options. And it's like the discussion we have had: who's going to be better? Realistically, I guess they could go out and try and get a Fields, but I just don't think they're in that kind of zone right now. I think they feel that they can put enough around Goff to kind of help him. My worry would be Ben Johnson leaving. I think it could fall apart as soon as he goes.
I think that's going to be the story of the offseason, that I think they stick with Goff, and then I think next season isn't as great, and then I think that's the end for him in Detroit. I'm not sure about his contract, but I don't think he is the future because I know Jared Goff. I've watched Jared Goff for many years, and he's fine when everything's going well. But as we saw last night, the moment there's pressure, the moment the game state isn't great, he's not a great quarterback. He's just a good one. Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, kind of the same player. But that's a nice hot take to end on. That brings us to the end of our show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at Wildcard Rewind. Head on over to our YouTube channel, search for us at Fantasy Wildcard, and make sure you give us a subscribe. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next week where we are reviewing the divisional round. Take care.